Good morning, everyone. If you're opening your Bible, you can open to Genesis chapter 30. We're going to be finishing up a little bit on last week's lesson. We're studying through our Bibles and in our second quarter of a 3.5 year study, and getting on toward the latter stories in the book of Genesis. Last week we saw how Jacob's family grew with his two wives and their two handmaids, and we'll be looking today at the flight of Jacob as they flee from Laban. So, as I mentioned, we'll get into Genesis 30 and 31 today, but just wanted to catch up on a couple of things from last week. We talked about Rachel and Leah and the birth of their sons, and the labor that Jacob does for his wife. I'm sure, just by way of recollection, how many years did Jacob work for his two wives? 14 years, right? 7, he worked in order to acquire Rachel, but then when he was deceived and received Leah, he then agreed to work 7 more years for Rachel. And so after 14 years, he's now been working for Laban. And so in chapter, let's see, I'm a little mixed up here. Chapter 30, you have this story of how Jacob now wants to provide for his own house. He's been shepherding the flock of Laban, right? And so he technically doesn't have any possessions. Laban had offered him wages. He didn't want him to work for him for free. And what did Jacob ask for as his wages? Anybody recall? Well, initially it was his wives, right? He asked for Rachel as his wage. That's what he worked 7 years for, and then he works the second 7 years for her again. And so he hasn't received those wages. He hasn't received any wages but his two wives. And so now he needs to provide for his own. So describe Jacob's deal with Laban to now provide for his own house.
So Jacob's wages would be to receive all the speckled and spotted sheep, all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats.
Okay. So I'm not a goat herder or any kind of a farmer, but he's saying, let's divide these things up, and I've driven past plenty of fields to see, okay, that group of cows have stripes. This group of cows are completely solid. The Black Angus or whatever the breed is, that's completely solid. And so Jacob is saying, give me the striped and the spotted ones. And he's trying to make a very fair deal, something that's not kind of up to him. In fact, verse 33, if you're in chapter 30, verse 33, he emphasizes that this will be an honest or a righteous way to divide things. He says, so my honesty will answer for me later when you come concerning my wages. Each one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, will be considered stolen. So this is how we're going to tell apart my flock from your flock. So then Jacob takes this portion of Laban's flock. It does seem, and I was reading a couple commentaries on how this was carried out, because they initially separate the spotted and the speckled ones and give those to Laban's sons. So it seems that the wages are from this moment forward, right? It's not every speckled and spotted animal that you already have is now mine, right? Because those are already born, those are already Laban's cattle. But he says, let's separate all those out. They give those to Laban's sons, take them away. And Jacob goes off with a herd of completely solid animals. No stripes, no spots. And so from a genetics standpoint, thinking about breeding, is that a good position to be starting from? Not so much, right? You think, well, you think you breed two solid brown cows, you're going to get more solid brown cows. He's starting from kind of a lesser position without any striped or spotted among it. So Laban, you would think, is going to get the upper hand. So how did Jacob now work to increase his own wages? He's got this half of Laban's flock to do what he will as the shepherd. So what does he do?
Well, he took those sticks and shaved the bark off some of them, and so that he puts sticks in front of in the trough, I guess, so that when they were drinking, they would see these sticks, and somehow that would genetically alter the animals so that they would come out striped. But it was actually all the power of God, I think.
Right. Yeah, ultimately, I think we're going to get to this power of God. But thinking through what he's doing there, it's a very strange thing, because to this day, and we're what, almost 4,000 years later, nobody can see a scientific connection to what Jacob did and how it might have affected the flock. He's essentially putting a visual aid in front of these animals. Like, here's what I would like for you to produce. I'm going to make you some striped and spotted things. I'm going to put those in front of you. He noticed the animals would mate when they come down to get a drink. So that's when they're mating. And so he puts this kind of suggestion in front of the females. A couple of commentaries I read just kind of pointed out that just because we don't know how that might have worked doesn't mean that we should reject it as not a potentially viable action, right? And so that was something, as they were breeding animals, perhaps something that was done if they wanted to generate a certain outcome. We know that it did produce the outcome, as we'll see here in just a moment, but his desire was to produce, obviously, more lambs and cattle that were of striped and spotted, and I think mottled is another word, which is the idea of brown, as I understand it. And so, what did he also do as he's trying to influence the strength of the herd? What did he do regarding the strong and the weak?
He would only do that. Like if they were hardy and healthy, he would only do the stick trick with them.
The stick trick, I like it. That's right. He would do the stick trick when the strong animals were there to mate, because he wanted to have the strongest lambs be striped and spotted. When the weak ones came down to drink, he took them away. And so the result was what? Looking at the end of chapter 30.
He became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female and male servants and camels.
Right, it even goes beyond animals at this point. And of course, in this agrarian society, you grow your herd, and then you can trade with that wealth, right? That becomes their currency, and it now produces, verse 43, male and female servants, camels, donkeys, all the things that show a person's wealth. And so, yes, you've got a flock that's very strong, that's Jacob's, and you've got a flock that's very weak and feeble, it says, and that's Laban's. So I asked you, do you consider Jacob's dealings, question 8, the last one from last week, do you consider Jacob's dealings with Laban's flock to be righteous? We noted that in the Old Testament, the Holy Spirit reveals the story and doesn't always say, and that was wrong, when wrong actions are taken. I'm not trying to persuade you one way or the other, per se. What did you put down? Do you consider this to be righteous action? Francis?
Yeah, because he didn't consider himself as And the fact that what would be, and later somewhere it was read that God saw the way that Laban had treated him, and he rewarded him because of that.
Yeah, I think in getting ahead into the next lesson, we're going to see that even more clearly in chapter 31. Chapter 30 by itself seems like a science project, right? And Jacob, seems to know how to influence the outcome. But chapter 31 sheds a lot more light on it, on the involvement of God in what Jacob is doing, and perhaps some faithfulness there from Jacob. In general, though, as you just think about, I'm going to enlarge my flock, and I'm going to injure my uncle's flock, or my father-in-law's flock here in this case, there's some questionable dealings there, right? What about some of these passages that I suggested that you go look at? When we think about our business dealings today, I'm going to do something that's going to make me succeed, but it's going to mean someone else is going to lose out. Does that align with some of the principles that Jesus gave us? We're supposed to be looking out for the good of others, right? And when we do, what does God promise? Right, He's going to be looking after you. As you look out for your neighbor, He's going to be looking out for you. Luke 6:38, for instance, is one that I had a boss at work who was a man of faith. He read his Bible every day at lunchtime, and this is one passage that he quoted to me one time. Luke 6:38, he said, "Give, and it will be given to you. They will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return." You think about the scales and how they're deciding, well, how much grain am I going to give you for these shekels, of a certain weight? Well, they're going to make sure that basket is completely full, right? That's the mindset we should have when we're in our business dealings, that I'm going to give my all. I'm going to give more than you deserve in the work that I do, because it says, by your standard of measure, it'll be measured to you in return. It's not, I'm going to try to cheat and deceive to eventually get the upper hand over the long haul. I'm going to, give, you think about how there's these, big bags of chips, and you open the bag of chips and it's just half full of air. It's like, come on, give me what I paid for. Everything seems to be getting a little smaller, and the price keeps going up, right? And I know some of that's inflation, but there's the idea that people are trying to cheat to get ahead. But no, the scriptural mindset is that our business dealings should be thinking of, how can I give not only what's fair, but pressed down, shaken together, and running over to the other person, right? What about Proverbs 11:25? Let's look at that. Anyone there would like to read that?
Generous soul will be made rich, and he who waters will also be watered himself.
Okay, that's right. Yeah, if Jacob had chosen to be generous and make sure that Laban was also, his flock was also going to be strong, with the strong males mating at the same time, do you think God would have still prospered Jacob? I think so. I think we know that from these principles, that he who waters will himself be watered. So that's something that we should remember. It's not necessarily a good example. Ecclesiastes 11:1, cast your bread upon the waters, and what? After many days, it shall come back to you. So be a giver. Be willing to sow, because God is the one who provides seed for the sower. You sow that which a man sows, that will he also reap. All right, we'll talk more about that as we get into today's lesson. So as we wrapped up lesson 16 last week, we saw the birth of 11 of the 12 sons of Jacob. And of course, these are going to be the patriarchs that we know that all the people of Israel will descend from these 12 men. We haven't seen the birth of Benjamin yet, but it's important to understand the birth of these 11 and then eventually 12 sons and where they come from these 4 women. There's a typo there. I grabbed this off the internet. This wasn't my typo, Bilhah. But you've got Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah first. And then Rachel gives her maidservant, and there's Dan and Naphtali. Then Leah gives her maidservant, and Gad and Asher are born. Then Leah is blessed again, and Issachar and Zebulun are born, and also Dinah. And then Rachel is blessed with children finally and is given Joseph and eventually Benjamin. All right, and we talked about the meaning of their names. We won't take time to go back through that right now. But later this quarter, we're going to be at the end of Genesis, and we're going to see how each of these 12 sons of Jacob are blessed by Jacob before he dies. And Nate pointed out to me after class last week that he's going to come back to the meaning of their names when he blesses them. So we'll get to look at that again in a few weeks. So now Jacob needs to flee once again. Second time, right? Second time he's had to flee from somebody. It made Esau pretty angry at him and had to flee. Now Laban's family is going to be a little upset and he has to flee again. So we're in Genesis 31. So in observing the reaction of Laban's sons to Jacob's prosperity, how do you now judge Jacob's behavior? How did they react?
They said that they had taken all their father's possessions and wealth.
That's right. Verse 1, Jacob's taken away all that was our father's. So as the sons, this is their inheritance. And this flock that they had is now significantly weakened. So is this righteous behavior that Jacob has done, seeing that it produced this reaction?
I guess for me, Todd, it's hard to ignore the rest of the context.
Yeah.
And what we're going to be getting into these upcoming questions, because we see God's hand in it. We see God's blessings. We see God saw and observed the dealings of Laban, which was not fair with Jacob, in spite of him messing with his wages a bunch of times and doing evil to Jacob. Mm-hmm. God was there to make sure my servant Jacob was going to be blessed. So,
right.
Is God blessing Jacob when he's doing what's wrong, or is he looking out for Jacob when wrong is being done to him?
Right. Yeah, that's the principles that we need to balance in this story. While if taken out of context, you just look at Jacob's specific dealing with the flock, you might say, well, this isn't the best example of how I should conduct business today. However, there's a context in which God is, like Jesse said, he's not only blessing Jacob, but he is kind of protecting Jacob while another man is taking advantage of him. And so he's somewhat righting that wrong. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so from the first mindset, though, there are a couple principles there that we want to think about as we deal with our brothers. Let's look over at Romans chapter 12. Romans 12, 17, and 18. You want to read that, Mom, when you get there?
What verses?
17 and 18.
Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men.
Right. And so as Jacob, now got the strength of Laban's flock, and he's got the weakest parts of that flock, it's not as far as it depended on Jacob, he's at peace, right? His actions have specifically produced now a great conflict in this family. So there is going to be some, you reap what you sow from that, and now he's got to flee once again. So we've got to be careful not to, just because Laban has been wicked to Jacob, doesn't mean that he should, in a sense, produce this conflict between himself and Laban. All right, question 2. How did Jacob learn of Laban's changed feelings? Does Laban come and tell him how upset he is with him?
Now what does he do, Jacob?
He hears it from Laban's sons.
He hears from Laban's sons. And what else?
Laban's countenance or attitude, his face changes.
Right. Yeah, verse 2 says Jacob saw, in the New American Standard, says Jacob saw the attitude of Laban, and behold, it was not friendly toward him as formerly. Any other words there instead of attitude in other translations?
His countenance, okay.
Anything else?
The margin for the word attitude
Is face. And so when I see the word countenance, we don't use that word much today, but I think of the expression on our face. First place I remember we encounter it is with Cain, right? When God recognizes, after he has killed his brother, he says, "Why has your countenance fallen?" Sorry, that's before he kills his brother. That's after he's offered a sacrifice that's not acceptable to God, right? And his countenance falls because he's not pleased God, and his brother has. And he says, if you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? It's a great principle for us to remember, right? If we're down, if we're depressed, we need to examine ourselves. Maybe we're not serving God like we should. And if we start to serve God like we should, you might just feel better. You might perk up knowing that my Father is pleased with me. So that can change our countenance. So here, Jacob sees the face of Laban. So I thought it'd be good just to think about that for a minute, about this nonverbal communication. He can tell that his father-in-law is not happy with him. Previously, you can imagine them getting along very well as Jacob is taking care of Laban's flock as his primary servant and son-in-law. But now Laban's upset with him. So how can this impact our relationships? How can nonverbal communication be a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, one form, I guess, of nonverbal communication might be ignoring somebody or being rude to them as far as not speaking to them, whatever, which is, I guess, ignoring them as well. That doesn't create a warm feeling. So.
Yeah, I think we've probably all experienced the silent treatment. Yeah, where the person's not speaking with you anymore. Or maybe we infer a silent treatment just because we haven't spoken to somebody in a while. It seems like they're just walking on by and not being as friendly as they used to be, and you feel like maybe something's wrong. And so you might have to go ask, is there something wrong? And then you may find out you've interpreted that completely wrong. Other times it's much more direct, where the person is clearly upset and stone-faced, unwilling to give you a smile, deliberately dodging you. So I don't know if these statistics are real, but 80% of communication is nonverbal, right? We gain a lot of information from things beyond words. So if that's true, how should we should we think about our nonverbals? What should we do?
Don't have a grumpy face.
Don't have a grumpy face?
Well,
Yes.
sometimes someone will be like, what's wrong? And you're like, nothing. It's just a resting face.
You know, it's helpful when someone will ask you what's wrong, because then you can explain.
Right.
So we need to be careful not to infer too much, right? And actually go
A
out.
conversation with somebody. But we should be careful with our communication. A person can gain a reputation of nobody, that person's unhappy with everyone, right? That person's completely grouchy or grumpy. We need to smile and let a person know that we have joy, that we are blessed. We shouldn't be a negative person all the time, as we are so blessed by God. Jason?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting topic, and for them it was very clear, but we need to be very careful, because to me what I take away from this, and just even over all of my dealings with a lot of people at work, with soccer, with church, you can't rely on nonverbal communication, and we more times than not assume the wrong thing. We need more verbal communication, and if you think that someone has an issue just because of the way they're looking, then we should ask. That's perfectly fine. Now that person, Clarissa, she said that, I've gotten that before. Why's your face like that? Well, that's my resting face, I'm sorry. That is the way that I look when I'm just thinking, and I'm not upset with you. But we need to verbalize these things. Because when we don't, and we assume someone has an issue with us, then now we're the ones that's hurting, and we're the ones that it's festering and getting worse. And so nonverbal communication can severely impact, but we need more verbal communication and not so much assuming what that person is feeling or thinking.
Yeah.
Great point. Anything else on this? Francis?
You can also have your nonverbal to be the absolutely opposite. They say a smile a day. Anybody that's not up to par, but if you just smile at them, that gives them some kind of positive attitude. So nonverbal is not always bad.
Right. No, that's exactly right.
Right. We can approach even a difficult subject, a difficult conversation with another person in a positive way. We need to be careful, I think. Obviously, there are times when we have to break fellowship with another person because they have been unwilling to repent of some sin. And even in that extreme case, what does the Bible say that we should regard them as? Yeah, you admonish him. You do not regard him as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother. So even in that case, so this person's been withdrawn from, I run into them, I can still say, hey, I'd love to sit down and talk with you sometime. I'd love to talk about the things that caused us to have to separate to help perhaps bring you back to the Lord. We can say those things in a positive way because we're brothers. We all want to go to heaven. But then there's the cases that fall well short of that. This person's not been withdrawn from in any way, but there's a problem, right? Maybe there's just a little issue, maybe a big issue, but just something that needs to be talked about. And there can sometimes be a deliberate snub that develops where, I'm not in alignment with what that person thinks or feels or has taught or whatever it is. And we need to be careful not to almost go even farther than you should when you're admonishing a person who's been withdrawn from with a person who's still your brother. We need to have that friendly, nonverbal communication with that person so that they know that we can still have a relationship, we can still talk about the things that we need to talk about without any fear of talking to me, right? So think about what we're communicating with our face. We want to have an open, approachable face or countenance. So we took a lot out of that. So Laban had a face that communicated that he was not happy with Jacob. So now Jacob is going to relate a vision to his wives. Let's read this section, starting in verse 3, and we're going to go down through. We're going to go down through verse 16. So let's start with Ray and Shirley. We're going to start in verse 3 of chapter 31, and we're going to stop at verse 16, and we'll take 2 verses apiece. And if you don't care to read, just nudge the person next to you. We'll go Ray and then Shirley, and then on that.
And the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your father and to your family, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field and to his flock.
And he said unto them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not toward me as before, but the God of my father hath been with thee. And ye know that with all my power I have served your father.
Yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not permit him to harm me. If he said, the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. If he said, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock bore striped.
Thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. In the breeding season of the flock I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled.
Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, Here I am. He said, Lift up your eyes and see that all the male goats which are mating are striped, speckled, and mottled, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you.
I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now arise, get out of this land, and return to the land of your family. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, Is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house?
Are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money. For all the riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do it.
Okay. So we have a statement from God in verse 3. The Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. So he's now being told it's time to go. And so Jacob goes and talks to his wives, somewhat of a secret meeting. He calls them out to the flock, right? He's out with the flock, pasturing the flock, and he calls them out to the flock to talk with them. So it's not in the tents where Laban might hear. And he relates this vision. What are some of the elements of the vision that he's seen from God?
What did you notice there, Francis?
Well, he saw that he had prospered through God.
Yes. So God
had prospered him. This was God providing for him. What else?
What did the angel show him in his dream?
And he tells his wives that he had served him and he had deceived him and changed his wages 10 times.
Sure. So
it was justified in his mind that he's now taking what's his, right? Because Laban has been so unkind to him. We'll talk about that, changing his wages here in just a moment. But what was it specifically that was shown to him in the dream?
The animals.
He showed him the animals.
And how that all happened.
Right. And
I don't know the specific timeline here either. It's not super clear from the text. So it could be that everything that he did back in chapter 30 was specifically because that was what was shown to him in the dream. And so the specific way that he obtained Laban's flock was shown to him in a dream, that those who were striped, speckled, and mottled would be the ones that were mating. And so what does God also call himself here when he's speaking to Jacob in a dream?
I am the God of Bethel.
I'm the God of Bethel. We've got this photo up
For this week's lesson. This is a picture of Jacob at Bethel. Remember, he slept on a stone, and then when he woke up after seeing what we call Jacob's ladder, with angels ascending and descending from God, and God promising to give him the blessings of Abraham and to bring him back to this land, Jacob erected this stone. And so God recognized what Jacob had done. And Jacob, even though he's the one who chooses the name for this place, what did Bethel mean? Anybody remember?
House of God.
House of God, right? So Jacob
Felt like, wow, this must be a special place. This is where God's house or dwelling is. God accepts that title. God, he says, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar. So he pours oil upon a rock and stands it up so it'd be a place of remembrance. Where you made a vow to me. What was that vow?
that Jacob made. We kind of question
his faith when he was making that vow, but God certainly was listening. Do you remember what Jacob vowed?
Was it, if you be with me, I'll serve you, or protect me, I'll serve you?
Yeah, and God
had promised him some things in the dream, that he was going to be with him and bring him back to the land. And so Jacob then makes a vow, if that basically comes to pass, if I go away and I survive, first of all, but I'm also going to if I'm truly blessed and if God brings me back, then Jehovah will be my God, and I'll serve him here back at this place. So he says, I am that God. Verse 13 of chapter 31 is where I'm looking. Where you anointed a pillar, where you made a vow to me. Now arise, leave this land, and return to the land of your birth. So complete the vow. And what was Rachel and Leah's response?
Is there any inheritance left in our father's house?
Yeah, I don't know if there's
a ton of faith in their statement because their father's not got a lot for them at this point, but they do at least say what God has told you to do, let's do that. But it also seems to be in their best interest to go with Jacob, who has the bigger flock as well. So they're leaving home now. They agree to leave, and so they leave secretly. So we see God's providence here all throughout. So what charge does Jacob have against Laban? I think we've talked about that. He had changed his wages 10 times. We don't see all 10 changes in the story. So there's, how many years have elapsed? What was that? 20 years. So there's the 14 of serving him for his wives, plus 6 we infer for just now shepherding the flock of Laban with the striped and the non-striped separation. So 20 years. A lot can happen in 20 years. This idea of changing someone's wages 10 times, were these promotions and raises along the way?
That, I don't think that's what he means at all, right? Because we know
the ones we know of were not positive things. They were deceptions. What can that do to an employee or a son or a friend who's helping you?
It's going to build or strengthen that relationship. It's going to cause a lot of distrust and disrespect, maybe resentment.
That's right.
When we talk about integrity, when a person has integrity, what's the kind of simple definition of integrity?
Honesty.
There's consistency in their moral character there.
Yeah. I just think
of it as doing what you say you're going to do. And so if Laban says, yeah, you can work for me 7 years and I'll give you my daughter Rachel, he should have done that. But he changed his wages there and gives him the wrong daughter. And so he's doing that all the time. Sometimes we think, or I've heard it phrased, kind of moving the goalposts. Like, here's what you need to do. And when you do that, you're successful. Oh, well, that was too easy for you? Well, actually, what I really meant is you need to do this, and then I'll be pleased with your work. A bait and switch.
It's another phrase we use for it. It can be
Incredibly discouraging to anybody. We've got to be careful not to do that. I referenced Proverbs 13:12. Did anybody take a look at that and see kind of how that relates?
Desire comes, it is a tree of life.
Right. Hope deferred.
What does that mean?
Delayed. Right.
Like, this is what you're working for. There's one proverb that talks about a man's hunger urges him on while he works. Right? Well, what if when you get to the end of the project, it's like, oh, well, we're actually not eating now, we'll serve dinner in a few hours. We need a few more hours of work out of you. Well, that would be incredibly discouraging. I was working for that prize at the end. Francis?
That's why we worked the first 7 years, and it was like daylight to dark. Here I am, and now 7 years has passed. Come on, Rachel. But it didn't happen. But then he worked the other 7 years. He actually did have Rachel for those remaining 7 years, but still it wasn't the same as the first 7 years because he was eager.
That's right.
That's right. So how can that problem manifest in our relationships? Have you guys seen that in life? Hope deferred?
How have you seen that? Any examples?
Didn't trust.
What was that?
You wouldn't trust him.
You wouldn't trust him. Yeah. Yeah, I've seen fathers that are maybe not careful enough with their words, telling their kids, we'll do this. I'm going to do this and that and the other. I'm going to build this. I'm going to take you these places. I'm going to do whatever. And I have to be careful myself not to do that, because it's like, well, okay, if we can get this work done, then we'll go do something fun later. And then that doesn't happen, and anyway, the kids can get discouraged. You got to be careful not to do that. You need to be a man of integrity on your word as well. That's just one example that I thought of. All right, we'll pick up on question 5 next week, which is the sin of Rachel as they're fleeing from Laban. Thanks, everyone.